Welcome, everybody. Go ahead. My name is Nathaniel. This is the University Counseling Center's grief workshop in partnership with our Department of Psychology and with our Alcohol and Drugs Taskforce. And so hopefully that's where you're meant to be, because that's where you are. We are going to be here for, about 2:30 probably. So we'll have plenty of time to walk through our material together today, and then plenty of time for any questions and things like that that you have for us as well. Okay, wonderful. So this is our grief workshop, and we're going to start off with a little bit just kind of about Jocelyn and I as presenters, just to kind of give you a little view of where we're coming from, and then we'll jump right into the material. Sound good? All right, thanks. So, Jocelyn, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Fuentes. I'm a first-year master's student in the College Counseling and Student Development program here at APU. So I'm going to start off by talking about, like Nathaniel said, kind of my background. So as I already mentioned, current graduate student. I'm also first generation. I'm the oldest in my family, so that's like really important to me and why I want to talk about this topic. And then I'm a cisgender woman. I was born female. I present as a woman, and I identify as a woman. So I think that's also very important. My ethnicity, so I am Latina, but I am more specifically half Guatemalan and half Mexican. So again, these are all like really important things about my identity and why I bring this topic here. I don't consider myself very religious. If I had to put a name to it, it would be agnostic. I do believe in God, but I won't touch too much into that, just from my personal experience. So my experience with grief is twofold, and it was while I was a college student, while I attended UC Davis. So I lost my aunt when she was 25 years old. She unfortunately got hit by a drunk driver, and that started my grief experience. So that's why I wanted to bring this topic to you all as undergraduate students. The second part is that I lost my grandmother about 11 months later in March of 2017. So those two are the most impactful experiences I've had. I was a student, I lost, dear loved ones. And that's why it made it such an important topic for me to bring it to other people. That's why I'm discussing it here today. And with that, I will introduce Nathaniel.
And Jocelyn skipped her title. She's the graduate coordinator for peer education for the University Counseling Center. Whereas I'm the psychologist/outreach coordinator for the University Counseling Center. So I'm a psychologist. I've been working here for 6 years in that position. I'm a heterosexual cis male. I have mixed racial background. And I grew up Lutheran, right? I still identify as Lutheran, and I've been that way since I was a kid. There's an old Mitch Hedberg joke. I used to, and I still do, right? So my experience, that makes me passionate about talking about grief, is particular for college students as well, is that my father passed away suddenly to a heart attack the summer between my freshman and sophomore years of undergraduate work. I was over at Cal Lutheran in Ventura County, in Thousand Oaks area, if any of you are familiar. So that's kind of what drove me into this position, into going into counseling in the first place. And then Jocelyn started working for us this year, and she told me a little bit about her own background as well. And I thought, well, hey, let's do a grief workshop, because I think the synchronicity is there. So I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn, who's going to kind of go through a lot of the learning outcomes and things like that for us. We're going to start with DABDA, which is like the stages of grief. You've probably heard about that before. And then we're going to try and help you understand if you're going through something, or if somebody you know is going through some kind of grief, what those common reactions might be, what kind of functional impairments it might specifically have for students, and what you should look out for. And so Jocelyn's going to cover those two topics, and then I'm going to kind of jump in and talk more about coping strategies and relevant resources and things like that. So that's our outline for the day. Well, that's our learning objectives for the day. Yeah.
All right. We're going to dive right in. I'm going to talk a lot about definitions. So first definition is grief. And according to the American Psychological Association, grief is the anguish experienced after significant loss, usually the death of a beloved person. Already kind of touched on that. I lost people who were near and dear to me. And a second definition by Mukal et al. Is grief is a natural and universal response to the loss of a loved one. The grief experience is not a state, but a process. We will go deeper into that later. I don't want to touch too much on that last part just yet. And the definition of bereavement. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of bereavement. Bereavement is usually tied to how much time you get to take off from having lost a loved one. That's more in like professional settings. But the definition is the condition of having lost a loved one to death. The bereaved person may experience emotional pain and distress and may or not express this distress to others. Individual grief and mourning responses vary. Again, on that tiny last part, we'll go deeper into that a little later. Don't want to give you all that information up front yet. And that definition is by the American Psychology Association again. And then grief and bereavement are not only associated with the loss of a loved one. It depends on the person, but each like traumatic experience could have you feel grief. For example, breakups or separations, that gives people a sense of grief, what could have been, all that stuff, memories and stuff. Losing a job or something similar. And what I mean by something similar is like kind of tying into natural disasters. We had really bad fires in Pasadena in January, and losing a house, losing all the memories associated with that can bring on sensitive grief as well. So like, once again, why I think this topic is very broad and very important to talk about. And then diagnosis of terminal illnesses. Sometimes people get diagnosed with certain illnesses, and that brings on grief for them. Having to deal with like a potential like process of nearing death or whatever. And it also has to do with like family members who, have someone going through that stuff. You might grieve them as well. It's called like a living grief kind of. I won't touch too much on that for this, but we'll leave that at that. Next slide, please. So we're going to go into stages of grief. If you've ever heard of the DABDA model, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is the one who coined that. And DABDA just stands for denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This model was created after hearing her client's story. She worked a lot with like patients and would hear about their life and what they were going through, and stuff about how they felt about getting older and potentially getting closer to their life ending. And it varies across different cultures. Like certain people don't mourn the same. There are certain practices that people do that last weeks, that last days, that last hours. I don't know, it depends. And this is usually what the model kind of looks like. It's more like a slopey kind of model. And that's the way that she coined it. But granted, this was also like many, many years ago. So that's not really how it looks now. What I consider the stages of grief to look like is this. It's like if you've ever had Play-Doh and you like mix all the colors together and you can't pick them apart. That's truly what I think grief is. It's like, you can kind of see the colors here, like, oh, this is depression, this is anger, but it doesn't always feel like that. Feelings are gonna get like really complicated, and it's just an amalgamation of stuff. So I really like this concept and showing that this might look like the reality for some people. It's not the same for everybody, but I like this representation. So another way to kind of put it is that little picture in the corner. Everything's all jumbled up. Everything's all like mixed together, and you can't really pick it apart. But what I really want to focus on is like many people experience the stages differently. I put stages like that because it is kind of an outdated model, but a lot of the framework still stands today. And it's mostly because like you can be in the denial and bargaining phase. Like you can be in both at the same time. You can also be in an anger and denial phase or depression and anger. It really depends on who you are and what it is you're going through. So it's just really like hard to put words to it sometimes, and that's totally okay too. Denial is usually listed as the first phase for this model, but it's not always like the very, very first thing that people experience when they start dealing with grief. I've already mentioned like emotions work differently for everyone, and that stands true in that resource by Holland. More often than not, this model has phases, and it's used as a guide. It's not a step-by-step depiction. We can't sit here and tell you this is exactly where you're going to go through. It will be very, very different for everybody, but more often than not, the key points like depression, anger, and all that stuff will be the more prominent parts. And lastly, each loss will impact your life in different ways. Therefore, each loss will be different, and each process through grief will be different. So as I've already stated, losing somebody suddenly, which I had to go through, was one way I grieve. And the second part was losing my grandmother to terminal illnesses. That was very slow. That was very slow working. The first one was very sudden and very like immediately I was already in it. The second one was like, okay, I've felt these feelings before, but it's odd because she's not gone yet. So that's kind of where I was feeling with that. And that's my personal experience. So we're gonna dive deeper into denial. So denial is basically how our brains are trying to process what we were just told. You got a phone call saying this and this happened. The main part of denial can be shock. And shock is funny because technically it would come out before denial. You would listen to a phone call, for example, like I received a phone call. So the shock was like, that cannot be, that was my initial reaction. And that's normal. That's totally normal. You're gonna think, why are you telling me this? Like, what is happening? It's very, again, shocking. And then that leads into denial, but it really presents differently for everyone. Many people are gonna be like, that's not true. I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna see them later. Oh, let me stop by their place and I'll see them right there. I actually didn't have that. I don't want to call it a privilege because this is a very complicated process. But I didn't have that. I was 400 miles away from school, and I was like, oh, by the time I get home for spring break, I'll see her. That wasn't the case for me. I had to really internalize what I was being told because I was like, no, there's no possible way someone could be playing a joke on me. It has to be true. So I didn't have that mentality. I just had to understand that my aunt was gone. Second, anger from joy, from inside out. Sorry. Yeah. So I really like that. Really great depiction. But anger is not always like just being angry at something. It's usually considered like a response to the pain that you're feeling, and it's not always an angry outburst. It's not always like, oh, like throwing things. It's just depends. But anger actually could show up as like questioning, like, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my family? Why, a higher power could let this happen? More often than not, people are going to think, but that person was such a good person. Why would it happen to them? Blah, blah, blah. That's kind of what I thought. I was like, but why would that happen to my aunt? She was such a great person. I love her. It's just, it's just a lot of questions that they bring up. And in different cultures, like Western cultures, men are allowed, or it's acceptable for men to show anger. While women, it's seen as like not okay. It's seen more as like a manly trait than it would be like a womanly trait. And then also in some religions, people may struggle to share their real emotions for fear of judgment, and that just means like not diving into those true emotions and trying to tell someone about them because you're fearful that maybe they won't give you the answer that you're seeking, or maybe they just won't understand. And other religious traditions, anger may seem bad. Like, you shouldn't be feeling angry. You should just be joyful that you had that time with them. You should feel this and that. But anger is like a regular emotion that people feel, and it's not always something you can control. The next one is bargaining. So now we're in the middle of DABDA. So this is essentially saying, like, I would give anything or do anything to have this person back. That could be like what if scenarios, or if only I did this and this. So like an example, what if I didn't do this or that? Would they still be here? If only I could have seen them one more time, maybe I wouldn't be so sad. I had to go through this. I was like, oh, if only I could see them one more time, I wouldn't be this sad. If I hadn't gone to school 400 miles away, would they still be gone? I didn't personally like that line of thinking. It really didn't help me, going through this process. So it really depends on like what it is you're going through. Kind of I already touched on, you could be thinking about having gone down a different path than the one you chose. Like, again, I went to school really far. And then it could also you could also have a religious aspect to this. Some people might try to make like deals or promises to God or a higher power in order to heal. Oh, you make me feel better. I'll do this and this. I'll attend services more. I'll do more community service, And that's what bargaining is, like trying to make a deal. You're not feeling all these feelings. I really like this, call it quote, call it, you know, they kind of post them on Instagram. And it talks about like, when you pass away, I remember thinking, why did it have to be you? Why did it have to be like a good person? Why? There are so many bad people in this world and they took one of the best souls. I've never known, I won't ever understand why. I feel like this resonates with myself a lot. Just questioning like, I thought you were great. You know, why did this have to happen? And then we're going to talk about depression. And this is usually, very, very low, sad feelings, intense sadness, numbness, not capable of feeling any other kind of emotion except like down. And this could, for students, could look like their grades getting lower because of lack of effort. And this could also look like self-isolation. They might not be taking care of themselves. They might not be eating as much. They might not be, taking care of their hygiene, not showering as much, not changing their clothes, not getting out of bed. And for cultural differences, some people may be more likely to intensify emotions across cultures and situations, whereas others may generally be more inclined to suppress them. So for certain people, they'll be more inclined to like be open and tell someone else what they're feeling. And in a religious aspect, occasionally, being open like that and having those feelings might have you be feeling judged if someone doesn't, answer you the way that you would want to be answered or doesn't deem your feelings as acceptable. From my personal experience, Latinx families don't take depression seriously. It's like you can't be depressed. I did this and this when when I was your age, and it's kind of hard to like, well, I'm still feeling it. And in other cultures, women are allowed to display sadness or depression, and men are not. So that's kind of funny. Remember, anger is more acceptable for men to feel anger, like outwardly, publicly, but for women, it's more acceptable for them to feel sadness, to feel depression, and men not as much. It's not taken as seriously in men sometimes. And then, sometimes people are not allowed to share their thoughts with others based on cultural norms. If you don't have those types of families where you talk about your emotions, you talk about your feelings, that might be like something that kind of stifles your process, but that just depends on families and whoever the person is. So the last part of DABDA is acceptance. And it doesn't always mean accepting that the person is gone. This phase will be entirely different. I know I've said that several times, but acceptance will look extremely different from person to person. And everyone will accept their situation in their own way. It's not always meant as like, oh yeah, I accept that they're gone. It's more so I accept this new reality that's happening without them. That's kind of the way I saw it. And acceptance is not an end goal. I wouldn't describe it as like, oh, I got to acceptance, my grief is done. That's not really how it works. For myself, my significant losses happened 9 and 8 years ago, respectively. So my aunt 9 years ago, my grandma 8 years ago. I still have a little trouble talking about them and talking about this topic. So I don't really know what acceptance looks like, but that's totally okay. I am glad to have had those people in my life, and I cherish the memories that I did make with them. So that's my aspects for acceptance. So again, little Instagram pictures. I really, really like this depiction of grief. It says people tend to believe that grief shrinks over time and gets smaller. It's not actually true. The space that you hold around your grief, like a little jar, actually gets bigger. That's been my experience. I still have the same like circle. My space to hold it is a little bigger, and that just comes with time, unfortunately. And then this next part, grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. All of that unspent love gathers in the corners of your eyes as tears, the lump in your throat, and in the hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. And I honestly think that resonates really true. I can't call that person up. I can't call my grandma anymore, tell her I love her. And that's what I feel like grief is. Just things I can't do anymore. Things I can't say to her anymore. That's really been my experience. So I've talked about grief, what does it do for students? Like, how does it impact students academically? So this can disrupt sleep patterns. You might be sleeping less, you might be sleeping more. Really depends. Completing assignments, you might not see the point anymore. You know, you're just like, I don't need to do that. I don't really want to. I don't see the point of doing it. My grades, whatever, could affect test taking. Grades can begin to suffer. Your friendships could change too, and that's the reality. Like a lot of people don't talk about. When you're going through all this stuff and then all this stuff starts to happen, you might seem like, or your plan might seem off track as a student. Your goals could change. Your career goals might not be the same. I know I went through that. I changed my career goal, you know, after losing my grandma a couple months after, not immediately after. And a new purpose might be realized, like myself. I was actually pre-vet when I was an undergrad. Funny, it's not pre-vet stuff, is it? But yeah, so I find that to be really true. For undergraduate students here at APU specifically, it is very important to advocate for yourself by explaining to people, you know, you might need an extension for a test or a paper or something. You know, you have to advocate with professors, faculty, staff, and even advocate for chapel attendance. You know, I can't attend because, you know, this and this happened in my family. So you really have to be on top of it. If for whatever reason you find yourself not being able to accomplish getting any accommodations like that, you're more than welcome to try and go to the Accessibility and Disability Resources Office, and they can try and help you with that. Sometimes things are a little more, you know, hard to accomplish, and you could try to go there and see if they can help you out. And that's more so just to get more time on like tests, like whatever assignments you might be falling behind. And then how does it affect your well-being? Again, as students, there's a lot going on. You've got tests, you've got assignments, you've got group projects, you're trying to have a social life. And your mental health can begin to decline because of grief. And this is like lack of motivation, less socialization, not going out as much, loneliness, self-isolation. You're no longer interested in your hobbies. You know, if you like to play video games, you're not playing video games anymore. Your coping skills might not be as helpful. And then I kind of touched on this earlier, like your physical health might be impacted. Hygiene starts to look less important. You're not taking showers, you're not brushing your hair, you're not brushing your teeth, you're not changing clothes. And then you can also have a change in appetite or changes in weight. And this is like over time, not usually like super fast, but you start eating less at the beginning of being told all this information. As you start going through all this process, you might start eating more, just really depends. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Brown.
Yeah, so I thank you, Yossi, for sharing all of that. And I think, you know, it would be rough if we left here. Well, have grief work, right? You know, if you do have grief, go to ADR, you know, which is a good advice, right? And we also take from the University Counseling Center. There's no way I'm going to get away with a presentation where I don't bump up our services, right? All our services are 100% free, 100% confidential, available right here on campus or via Zoom. But let me get into what we're actually here for to talk about today, which is coping with grief. So we have actually up here some handouts. So if you didn't grab one on your way out, feel free to grab one. Those of you that are online, also, I guess you could take pictures of slides, or you could email us as well. We're happy to send you the paper copy. But these are some common things that we suggest when somebody's dealing with, right? And Yoselin was talking a lot about just the physical stuff, right? You're either sleeping all day, every day, or you're not sleeping at all, right? You haven't taken a shower in a week, right? You haven't done laundry in a month. These kinds of things snowball over time when we're feeling depression, the depression that comes from grief a lot of the time, right? And so very simple physical self-care things can actually go a really long, right? And so when you are not feeling good, when you're feeling that Play-Doh of emotions that we were talking about, right? Take some time to eat some food, get a drink of water, wash your face, you know, take a shower, right? And I'd say these things, they're so simple, right? But they're going to require so much extra energy, because that's what depression is. That's what grief is that block on that extra energy, right? And so as much as you can, push yourself just to take the one step at a time, right? So like if you have it, you know, taken a shower in like 3 days. Don't make plans to like, oh, I'm gonna go out with my girlfriend's dancing or whatever, right? Like, let's get you in the shower first. Then let's make our slow steps up to that. Let's start with like eating a meal or having a quiet like night in with friends or something like that, right? It's about those physical self-care strategies, but taking one step at a time. That kind of leads me into this idea about being flexible, right? So, especially right after a significant loss, right? The further we get away from a significant loss, the more we need to kind of like reset our routines and those kinds of things, right? Even still, though, they're not going to be exactly the same routine. Just like Yosin's idea about that jar analogy, right? That grief is never going to go away. It's always going to be a piece of your life, right? But your strengths can grow and change. But anyways, immediately after a loss or immediately after an event that's causing you significant grief, go ahead and be flexible with yourself, right? Sometimes it's going to be really important that you go to class, right? Because like, I mean, going to class is like good for your grades, but like more so for your own personal wellness, right? That structure might help you, right? Sometimes it's going to be important that you do go to work, right? Because then you're like doing something that's distracting you, right? But other times it's going to be important that you don't, right? That you go ahead and give yourself a break, that you call out, or that you ask for that extension, or whatever it is, right? That little bit of flexibility in your schedule is really good because it allows you to try and like be adaptable to things that your body needs on a day-by-day basis. There's I can't remember who the quote came from, but I really like this idea that sometimes we have griefy days, right? Rather, like grief is not like a linear process, right? Just like Yoselin was saying, just like the original Kubler-Ross Dabbit model, right? Grief is that messy Play-Doh. And so sometimes it's going to be worse some days than it is others, right? And so if you're working with somebody, a significant friend, partner, family member, whatever, loses somebody, right? Help be flexible with them, do what they need on that day. If it's you, do what you need on that day, right? Be flexible with yourself and compassionate toward yourself. Which goes into my next point about like giving yourself permission, right? So giving yourself permission to feel your feelings. We talked a lot about varying cultural practices, right? Nielsen was touching on them. And clearly we didn't cover all cultures, all, diversity statuses, because we just don't have time right now, right? But like, there are so many different rules about how you can feel or how you should feel your emotions, right? I know that I myself, right? My dad passed away, right? So I'm a heterosexual, cis male, Latinx person, right? So like, I'm multiracial, but that's a big part of me, right? I shouldn't be sad. That's not a thing that I should be, right? And so I shouldn't even be emotional at all, right? I shouldn't be affected, right? That's sort of the narrative, right, of machismo and manliness, right? And so I tried not to be, right? And that didn't work great. And I was very fortunate to have good friends around me, actually friends that I still have to this day. My roommates and a few other college friends that were able to come surround me and like convince me, no, like it's okay, Nathaniel, to feel your feelings. And now I'm here trying to transmit that statement again to you all, right? It's okay to feel your feelings, and if you don't feel them, if you just suppress them too much, you're never gonna really deal with them and grow from them, right? Of course, we can wallow in our feelings too, right? We shouldn't necessarily wallow every single minute of every single day in our feelings, right? But I find much more often people don't like to feel griefy feelings, and so they try and push them away for whatever reason that is, right? And if you spend all your time pushing them away, you don't have any time to process them. You don't have any time to grow in your capacity to feel them. The other thing is just to lean into the power of normalcy, right? That was one of the big things that Yosin and I wanted to talk about. That's why we spent so long going through that GABDA model and explaining it all and that kind of stuff, is because the reason I can tell you this model, the reason I can tell you what happens when you feel grief is because it's a universal human experience, right? We don't all feel it all exactly the same way, but we all feel something. And there's similar themes in all of them, similar themes around denial and anger and bargaining and whatever the D and the A were. Help me out again. Depression and acceptance. Thank you. I was falling apart. So all of those similar themes, right, are going to play out to one extent or another for all of us. And so know that what you're feeling is normal. Know that what you're feeling is real, and that other people are feeling that way too about their significant losses. Because if you feel like you're not normal, you're going to lead yourself to suppressing even more. And then that's going to make the grief worse, down the line. Right? Another thing is reaching out to other people, right? Reaching out to other people can be really hard, right? Especially when we're in that depression phase, right? And we're shutting down on ourselves, then it's really hard to reach out to other people. Like I said, it was helpful for me. I had people reach out to me, which was wonderful. And I was very lucky for that. And so if any of you are supporting somebody who's going through something, please reach out to that person, right? But if you are going through it too, put yourself as much as you can into reaching out to somebody. Simple text, something like that, right? It's going to be hard to do, but spending time with somebody that you are close to, especially, right? Not just around people in general, but especially can those go-to people, some kind of mentor or some kind of family member, who's sibling, aunt, some kind of friend or like childhood bestie or romantic partner, something like that, right? These people that are close to you in your circle, those are the people to reach out to at this time, right? I mean, also maybe like, I don't know, if you want to go out and make new friends, good on you, that's great, right? But usually that's not what drives us towards, and that's usually the harder thing to do, right? And so lean into those connections where you have them that are already supportive of you. And one of the interesting things is that we know that helping someone who is also grieving is actually useful in our own grieving, right? This is something that, this is why Yoselin was so passionate to put this workshop on. This is why I became like a counselor, right? It's because like I got passionate about helping other folks going through grief because it helps me still, even though I still feel that grief inside of me, right? Doing events like this helps me. And in the immediate aftermath of a loss, it can be especially important too, right? For instance, like unfortunately we had some several student passings last year in our undergraduate population, right? Those are some corporate losses, right? A lot of people know some of these people, right? Or we were talking about the fires that just happened in January. Right? These are corporate losses. Lots of people were heavily affected, right? And so when we are in communities like we are here in a university, right? There's oftentimes grief events are corporate, right? Where they affect multiple people. And in those spaces, reaching out and helping others can help both of you, right? If two people help each other and they're both grief is getting better faster, right? And so that is an incredibly important thing to do. Another way to do it is just to understand yourself, right? And so we say keep a journal here. Keeping a journal can be really a good idea, or anything that really helps you get like deep in yourself. Maybe you're not the journaling kind of person. Maybe you are. Maybe you have like all the different colored markers and the beautiful like stationery and whatever, right? Or maybe you've never kept a journal at all in your life, right? But the idea about keeping a journal is to help elucidate some of those feelings that you're having, right? Some of that messy Play-Doh, right? If you can identify the anger that you're feeling, you identify the depression that you're feeling, you can identify that like shock feeling and denial feeling that you're feeling. If you can help journal some of those things out, or if you're a verbal processor, talk them out, to somebody if you want to, or even to your mirror if you feel like it, right? Whatever way you can do it to like get some like perspective on the emotions is going to help you categorize them better, because otherwise it's going to be that messy, chaotic mess, right? And that chaotic mess is a lot harder to deal with. And then the last one we have on here is pray. Ask God to walk through with you in these times. And like maybe you don't necessarily, whatever religious tradition you are, maybe that has a God in that tradition, maybe it doesn't, whatever it is, the religious practices that you are part of, leaning into those becomes incredibly important. You can give me the next slide there. My own personal example, for instance, like I said, I'm a Lutheran, but my dad's side of the family is Catholic. They're Mexican Catholic. My mom's side of the family was, American Southern Baptist. And so this is a theology joke that probably nobody gets, but if you take Baptist and Catholic, you compromise at Lutheran. Yeah, nobody gets that joke because that's a joke for a theology class, not like a Greek workshop. But anyways, so I grew up Lutheran, but it had some heavily like Catholic influences in my life as well, right? And so when like some significant passings have happened in my life, like when my dad passed away, and also my maternal grandmother and my paternal grandfather and grandmother have all passed away now at this time as well. Um, Specific religious practices can help you in that grief, right? John 11:24 like is about like when uh, Jesus comes and to Lazarus, for those of you that are Christians, for those of you that knows the story, right? And he says, that we will all live with him, and the resurrection after death, right? And with Lazarus, it's physical right there, but right. Those passages, those like can give you hope. And those are oftentimes used like in these settings as well. They're historically used by the church or historically used by whatever faith tradition you're in, whatever scriptures are historically used around grief. They take on an extra power because of that historical significance, right? Psalm 23 is, the yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? Many of you may be familiar with that psalm. It's very commonly used at funerals. That was what my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, wanted at her funeral. And I was running that. I was the officiant of that funeral, and it was really hard, right? But that piece was really important. And like even stuff that's not necessarily like in the specific religious text, right? I've been talking about like specific Bible verses that helped me, right? But also specific religious rituals and practices, right? I mentioned I was officiating my grandmother's funeral, and I'm Lutheran, right? The Evangelical Lutheran Book of Worship, the ELW, has a script for a funeral, right? And the way that it goes and the prayers that happen, right? And I've been to many funerals, right? And it's always the same, right? There is some power in the historicity of that, right? So engaging in a funeral that followed that, pattern was important to me. That's why it may be important for you too as well to attend memorial services or to attend a funeral, to attend a wake or whatever it is, right? The things that are important in your religious traditions as well, right? Like on my dad's side, like when my tata passed away, like and my nana predeceased him by about 8 years. There's this little, it's actually a picture right here, this little matchbook. This is from an old Russian restaurant that has now been out of business for a long time in LA. But when my grandfather got back from the Korean War, and he was going to propose to my grandma, and they went to all like the nice restaurants, downtown, and they were not letting to any of them because they were Mexican, right? And so eventually the Russians were like, we don't care, right? And so they went to this place, they went to Moscow Cliff, and that's where my grandfather proposed. And he kept that little matchbook about that, and it's connected to that story, right? And so we put that on the ofrenda that we made for him, and that still sits on my mantle to this day, right? And that's a big important piece, right? So it's not always just the direct like religious scriptures that you're looking at, right? But those religious rituals and practices that are associated with the history and the tradition, right? That gives you comfort in some spaces, right? And so I can only talk about myself as this sort of weird Lutheran Catholic hybrid kind of person that I am. But each of you has your own traditions as well. And each of you that maybe aren't particularly religious either, there is something in your life, some meaning systems in your life, some rituals that might be important for you, even if they're not like religious rituals, maybe they're just like cultural rituals, right? But those type of rituals can be heavily important in coping through significant losses. Things don't to do, right? I just did all the stuff you should do. I'm going to hit you with the don'ts. Don't tell yourself just to get over it, right? That's not helping anybody when you say, I should be over this by now. It's been X, Y, or Z amount of time, right? That putting extra pressure on yourself makes you get over it less faster, right? So if you are worried about how quickly you're getting over it, don't stress yourself about that or you're going to make it worse, right? The other thing is like, you don't have to feel like you got to fight all the time. Fight the feelings. This goes back to what I was talking about feel your feelings. It's sort of the opposite. Don't fight your feelings, feel them. Another thing is, don't just go get wasted. Like, I mean, unfortunately, like that is like a thing that we think about a lot, right, is various substance uses as emotional coping mechanisms, right? And they numb you for a little while potentially. Let's not pretend that like intoxicating substances don't have an effect on you. They do, right? But they're not going to be good for your grief in the long run. You're just sort of delaying the grief, and then it's staying there and it's getting worse. So then you're drinking longer, or you're getting high longer, or whatever. And that could eventually develop into a problem, right? That makes things worse on top of the fact that you're still grieving, right? So use substances responsibly. Those are you're adults, you go do what you need to do in your life, right? But as a coping tool for grief, they're not effective. Another thing is don't make any big life changes immediately after loss, right? Both Yoselin and I are stories about people that changed their career trajectories because of loss, right? Yoselin, you changed your major, you changed what you want to do. Now you want to get into higher education. You know, I was a psychology major at the time, but I wanted to get into like HR and things like that. I was super into like social psychology and stuff, and I switched eventually to wanting to go into clinical psychology, wanting to do things like this and work in university counseling centers. But I didn't go do that the next day after my dad died. I didn't say, well, I'm dropping out of school and enrolling in a new school or something like that. Or I didn't say, well, I'm going to go, do this, that, or the other thing. I'm going to go fly to, the other side of the world or something like that. I'm going to spend a whole bunch of money. I'm going to make an irreversible decision, right? Those kinds of decisions you can't make when you're not in your right mind. And when you're grieving, you're not necessarily in your right mind, right? So grief will change you. Grief will potentially cause you to even change your goals in life, like we both changed our goals, right? But it's not healthy to change your goals on a dime. It's healthy to think about them, think through them, and then make it a considered choice. And finally, remember to be patient with yourself. I guess that's not a no. Don't avoid being patient with yourself. Actually, do be patient with yourself. I set up my slide wrong, but like that's the biggest thing out of it, right? All of the stuff we've been saying: feel your feelings, feel yourself around, be flexible, lean into your religious traditions. Don't hate yourself for not being over it, right? All of it really comes down to like letting yourself be patient with yourself, letting it be a process, letting that grief jar grow, like that Instagram picture Yoselin was showing. And I think that this is especially important as we think about like the way grief works, like even further on, right? So anniversaries of death, birthdays of people that have been lost, significant milestones, weddings or birth of children, things like that, right? Even coming and doing a grief presentation to a bunch of students, right? These things are going to reactivate some of your grief, even though if you feel like you've been over it, right? But then you dive back into it because I wish my dad was here. I wish my aunt was here to see me graduate. Whatever it is, right? Those are the things re-trigger the grief. And so be patient with yourself as they get re-triggered and go back and use some of these same coping mechanisms again. This was the griefy days thing that I was thinking about. It was literally the next slide. This is another one that Yoselin found, but like just a few, like a better graphic way to encapsulate many of the things we've already been talking about. Breathe, tell yourself you're doing okay, allow yourself to feel your feelings, say no to things you got to say no to. Accept that some days aren't going to be the best, and let your body feel its feelings too. You're not just grieving in your head and in your heart, the whole body is grieving. Remember that you're strong. Remember that grief can flow through you and flow into creative things in the future. I'm not a huge like silver linings guy. I don't really love the whole, oh, they're in a better place now thing, right? But I do believe, right, that as we grow and change, as we incorporate pieces into our story, including the losses that we incorporate in our story, they make us who we are and they generate new things, right? That's why I'm a licensed clinical psychologist today, rather than I don't know, an HR rep for some company or whatever, right? Not that that's bad, but that was not my calling. And now all the things that I'm doing are what I'm doing, And then rest is your friend, especially on those creepy days. So a few different resources to talk about. Number one is the University Counseling Center. If you're an APU student, right? Again, we're free. We're HIPAA compliant, confidential. We're here on East Campus if you want to come in person, or we can do phone or Zoom if you would like, as long as you're anywhere within the state of California. We also have 24/7, urgent care. Use it. I've got handouts up here if you want them. But other things you can go to too. Our House Grief Support Center is a great resource that Yusleen found that, some of these online communities can be really good, right? Because they can normalize, right? We talked about normalizing and feeling like you aren't going through this alone. Other people are feeling it, right? Some of these online support communities can be really helpful for normalizing. Or you might find books, right? Or you might find songs, right? That make you feel better. We posted some various different like Instagram memes throughout this, right? That have meaning, right? Or various different songs can be really important. I know that Yoseli and I were talking even about like sometimes songs like in your heart language, especially, right? Whatever that language that is closest to your heart, right? If that might be English for you or might not be English for you, right? Sometimes those have specialty significance that you might lean into. We're not on time. Not stupid watch. Okay, we're doing great on time. So that's what to do again for yourself. But a lot of that is also what you can do for a friend, right? But like I said, helping a friend is so important, because that was an important part of my story, right? My roommates and my friends, coming alongside me, helping me out. Actually, that's one of my friends who was critical in helping me overcome that is now my wife. We got married, several years later, and now we got 2 kids, and it's great, and that was also part of a weird creative thing that ended up growing out of something that was terrible, right? But anyways, if you're supporting people, if you're supporting friends, think about all the resources that we talked about, right? All the things that you could do to support you are things that you can try and encourage a friend to do. Encourage them to lean into those same things that we've been talking about, right? But sometimes, like, just because I taught you a bunch of stuff today, right? I don't want you to go up to your friend and say, like, I just attended the grief workshop and I know how to fix you. Let me give you this handout, right? That's not the way that we necessarily want to do it. Even if that would be useful. I mean, do share those resources. Do share, hey, like I learned this or I learned that, right? But oftentimes what we're going to our friends for is that support, is that connection, right? So like, and sometimes we jump to solving problems because it feels safer for us, right? When we want to say like, hey, that's a problem I can solve. I can feel like I'm making a tangible change. Whereas if I'm just sitting with you in your sadness, I don't feel like I'm being effective. I don't feel like I'm necessarily helping you. Maybe I start to feel my own feelings as well, my own feelings of sadness, my own feelings of anger, activating my own feelings of grief, right, from previous losses, right? And so those things can scare us away a lot of the time, right? And so we find ourselves leaning into some like terrible cliches, right? Like, oh, thoughts and prayers, or oh, they're in a better place now, or oh, life goes on, everything happens for a reason, right? Like I just said, I hate the silver linings idea, right? I like that movie, actually. That's a really good movie. But like, I hate the idea of like, oh, it all happens for a reason. This is the good thing that came out of it. We've been talking about good things that come out of loss today, but that doesn't make the loss good. The loss is still bad, right? And so if we lean into these cliches, they are more to help us than they actually help the person that we want to care for and be with, right? And so one of the ways that like I really like to say, you've probably heard the phrase like, don't just stand there, do something, right? I think when we talk about grief, I like to flip that on its head, right? Now, this is not me coming up with it. This is an apocryphal thing. Nobody knows who first said it, right? But the idea is don't just do something, stand there, right? Be there, be with somebody, what they need, whether they need to cry with you, whether they need to talk about their loss with you, whether they need to talk about something else entirely with you, whether they need to make big grand plans to go out and have a great time going to dinner and then going, out clubbing or whatever. But then right when you're about to leave, they're, sobbing in the bathroom and you cancel the whole plans and you just stay in that night, right? That's the being there thing rather than the solving it thing, right? And so don't just do something, be it. That's my biggest recommendation when you're trying to help something else go through. And that's what we have for you today. We're very happy to take whatever thoughts and questions you have. Hopefully we generated a lot of them for you.